Hello and welcome to IO Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zupko. The war in Ukraine has changed the fundamentals of the EU's energy security and brought Norway to the center of energy geopolitics. To illustrate, Norway's share of the German gas supply has increased from just under 20% in 2021 to 48% in 2023. Also, there is a significant income in Norway from the energy, from the oil and gas, which is approximately $125 billion in 2022, which, according to sources, is $100 billion more than in 2021. On the other hand, there is often a heated discussion in Norway about the EU, especially when adopting new EU laws and regulations. For example, the EU's Clean Energy for All European package. And also, it's not only EU, there are more energy partners of Norway, as Norway supplies, for instance, natural gas to United Kingdom. Therefore, we're going to speak about Norwegian energy security, strategy, and geopolitics with Professor Ole Gunnar Austvik. Professor Austvik, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Ole Gunnar Austvik is a Norwegian economist and political scientist specializing in political economy, oil and gas policy, and European integration. Currently, he is a professor of political economy and petroleum economics at the Inland Norway University of Applied Sciences. Also, an appointed senior fellow at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University. In addition, Professor Gunnar Austvik has been working with Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, Norwegian Business School, and Statistics Norway. So we divided this interview into three parts. We're going to deal with oil, with gas, and other energy export from Norway. So let's start with the first question. And I'm interested how Norway developed or evolved in oil's export strategy in the past few decades. What were the milestones, and what do you consider as very important time or very important events that shaped Norwegian oil export?
Well, I think first I have to go back to the very start of the Norwegian oil industry history in the 1960s, 1970s, where you had a very strong across parties opinion that it should be controlled, developed, and governed by the state. So the state had a hand at a very from the very start. They wrote something called the 10 Oil Commandments, directing that you should have a state-owned oil company, which was Statoil, now Equinor, the Petroleum Directorate to control the industry and other entities and policies in order to secure that you can develop a national Norwegian oil industry to maintain the economic and political control. So we're not ending up in Dutch disease or resource curses that, like many other resource-rich countries have done. So that was the start, and it was building up in the 1970s and 80s with this state-governed industry. And Statoil at the time was the name. It was a very important instrument in achieving this. Then came a period where the industry was more mature. They were actually slowly competitive towards foreign suppliers, foreign companies. The foreign companies, big companies like Mobil, Exxon, and others were involved from the very start because they had the knowledge about the industry, and Norway did not. So they were used as a training ground to achieve this competence. But when achieved, it happens more or less at the same period of time when you have also a more liberal attitude in world affairs, like after 1991, when the end of the Soviet Union and the more liberal ideas took place all over the world and in Europe. So then the industry was more on its own, although the state has maintained the possibility to control and direct developments. And it takes like 78% of the net profit to the state coffer, besides having like 40% direct ownership in fields. So they have a cash flow which is mainly consisting of this 78% taxes and the cash flow from the direct financial investments owned by the state, which is all then taken out of the economy and put into a petroleum fund. This happened in the early 1990s, and the fund grew very big, and it was very important in order to split the money in order to avoid inflation and appreciation of currency and such things that you have a Dutch disease experiences. So you have an involvement that you have more agencies, more companies, and in extraction, investment and extractions. The licenses were given to different groups of companies to exchange experiences, to control each other and other things in order to develop each field as efficient as possible. So you have this interaction between the state and the companies has been evolving from a lot of state in the 1780s, and then less and less, and now it is more a company view, but still the Ministry of Oil and Energy has the right to award the licenses, control it, and the system is still in place that you should have a political decision of whether or not to invest and produce and export. In terms of export, it was quite different situations for oil and for natural gas. Norway has always maintained that the sales of oil and gas from Norway should be a pure commercial affair, not a strategic affair, which I think is perhaps a wise way of putting it in words, but of course it has strategic implications for receiving countries, for the EU, as for a competitor in Russia, for instance, and as for ourselves. But we have a very low official profile on it, that we shall be a pure commercial line, not as the Russians do. They use it as a political instrument to achieve things, no? As we have seen, for instance, a long time between Russia and Ukraine as a weapon even. We are not there. We are trying to neutralize it as far as it possible, and it's of course less possible now than it was after the invasion of Ukraine. Yes.
You mentioned that the state granted licenses to the companies. And can we say a few words about what sort of companies, mostly Norwegian or international companies? So I'm just basically asking, how open is this market for the world?
I think, first of all, the Norwegian oil industry has been largely a success in terms of what I mentioned in political and economic control and in building a Norwegian industry. So in the starting phases, like 70s, 80s, and a bit onwards, you had the big international oil companies involved. ExxonMobil, Shell, all these big ones. Then they were investing in a large, huge fields. Then there have been withdrawing more of them from Norway, and it has, besides Equinor, the state oil company, you got a number of smaller companies growing, investing in smaller fields, which some of them have turned out to be big fields. So the mixture of companies involved now is more manifold and more like in international context, more unknown. There are Scandinavian or Norwegian companies growing up.
Right. Diversification always comes as a question when you export the oil. So, first question, what challenges does Norway face in diversification of the oil export? And if you can mention a few main countries that Norway exports the oil into.
You know, it's oil can be transported all over the world on tankers. So, but the transportation cost makes usual that for most oil exporting countries, they sell most of it to the neighboring, the closest countries, and for Norway, that's the European Union. So that's absolutely the dominating market is the European Union, and also then in Northern Europe is the biggest within the EU context. The same for natural gas. We will come back to natural gas perhaps, but even closer to Europe is the natural gas export, where you have all the pipelines linked up in a permanent basis, you can say, to different places in Germany, Belgium, France, and also to the UK. The UK is important as a part of so the Western Europe part. We also in natural gas also got a pipeline to Poland recently, just opened the day after the explosions in the Nord Stream in the Baltic Sea. But natural gas is a different thing because you have the pipeline issue linking Norwegian exports more or less 100% to the European Union and the UK. For gas, you had plans to sell a lot of LNG to the United States. We developed a huge field in northern Norway called Snow White, built on the purpose to sell LNG to the United States. And the United States were preparing to import a lot of LNG to cover their demand. But then came the shale revolution, and the US is now the biggest natural gas exporter or LNG exporter. So it's changed fundamentally. So also the LNG from Norway, in northern Norway, is going to Europe.
Speaking about oil sector in Norway, the crucial question is investment. And I'm interested, what sort of investments is Norway pursuing in infrastructure? Because you need to transport oil, as you said, by tankers or by pipelines. So in which stage is this element of the energy sector in Norway? And if you can also mention a few, let's say, important investments made till today.
Well, in a startup in the 1970s, it was thought that the oil should be transported to Norway and then sold onwards. We also had plans to build a huge refining industry. Some of it was actually built at Mongstad, north of Bergen. But quite soon it ended that most of the oil is loaded on the platform as what is called taken directly from the platform to the marketplace, which makes it more flexible. You have a huge Statfjord field. You have the Troll, which is both gas, it's also oil now, in the southern part of the Northern Sea. And then the development has been going north and north all the time. So I mentioned the Snow White for natural gas, but it's also oil fields up further north in the Barents Sea. So it's developing closer to the Russian demarcation line, which are oil fields with loaded on the platform, and then transported to as I said, anywhere in principle, but mostly to some of it to US also, but most of it to European harbors. Yeah.
Also, we see Norway as a huge advocate for human rights and everything which is connected to the equality. And I want to ask if you have any national guidelines or maybe regulations when you export energy, or for instance, in this case, oil. And if you have any restrictions to export oil to countries where we have authoritarian governments, or maybe human rights are not followed fully, because this is sort of ethical question. And also my students in Scotland, they ask, how those countries deal with this, that they advocate high ethical standards on one hand, and then they dealing with the energy, which is a very hard business worldwide.
Well, that's a good question. It's a hot debate. In Norway, you have it in what you call it, the climate split, that we should be actually, some say we should stop investing in oil because the future is green, and we should invest more in green energies, renewables, and that's a official debate about this. But in terms of selling what we actually produce of gas and oil, is not much. It's not politicized in this way. So you can sell these cargoes for oil, then, which is the most flexible one. They're going to, in principle, I think anywhere. I think it was some discussion about Israel once. We have different opinions, different camps, views on Israel and Palestine conflict. But I don't think there are any restrictions in selling oil to Israel either. We have, however, the ethical restrictions when we think about the petroleum fund, which has been, as you mentioned, is growing. Norway has made a lot of money on the high prices recently, but it is lasting for a long time. That we have huge revenues from this on the hand of state. As I said, state takes 78% of the net profit, the economic profit on the companies, plus they have like 40% ownership of the resources, the rest. So most of the economic profit goes to the hand of the state. And this money are all invested in the petroleum fund, which is, I think, the biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world now, like 12,000 billion euros in the size of that. And this is invested in shares and obligations and some of it in property. And this investment have some ethical restrictions that you shall have in terms of it should not be invested in companies using child labor or have any type of an ethical behavior defined in certain ways. But it's mostly like, it's not invested in it's mostly in Western countries, no? It's in Europe, United States, Japan, this type of things. So the restrictions are mostly going towards the companies they invest in. So they have an ethical committee which are evaluating this, and you have a number of companies that are actually blacklisted for that. But that's for the investment of the financial capital coming from the oil, but it's then financial, yes.
Right. Let's go to the gas sector for a moment. And of course, the biggest question that everyone wants to ask is the geopolitical implications of the war in Ukraine for Norway before and after in terms of European Union. So what can we say about this highly discussed topic among energy scholars worldwide? Because everyone is speaking about this topic. There are more camps, there are people who are portrayed Norway as a country that basically saved the European Union after cut of the Russian energies. And on the other hand, we have the camp arguing that Norway is profiting on this war in Ukraine. So we have like two opinions, and let's put some clarification and your opinion for this question.
Great. So this is challenging topics, of course, because it's bringing Norway into the geopolitics of energy so clearly, which Norwegian government didn't want to, because we have this commercial line, official line, that it shall not be. It will be a trade with anything like fridges or cars or whatever. This should also be politically neutral, but obviously it's not. And before the invasion, we have 3 or 4 gas suppliers to European Union. It's Russia, Norway, and Algeria, and partly Libya, Azerbaijan also. But Russia and Norway is the 2 big ones, at least in Northern Europe. And we had a competition in some way, but we also have some common interests with Russians in terms of prices, stability, market organization, and so on. But after the invasion, of course, Norway is entirely on the Ukrainian and Western side. politically. And it brought us into a situation where we should boycott the sanctioned Russian gas imports, that Norwegian gas became more important. So when you have the sanction, you had also plus the explosions in the Baltic Sea, the Nord Stream. Norway became the single most important supplier of natural gas to the European Union, which was a big concern for all these consuming countries being depending on this gas too. So Norway and Northern Europe especially is interdependent on this gas trade, making it necessary to close cooperation. And yes, the whole gas market has been built in a close cooperation between governments and companies on both sides. That's how you develop the pipeline and infrastructure all over, which is also the case with Russia and the EU, actually. So we become more important, and the prices went high. But I think to some extent it's exaggerated how much the invasion meant for the prices, because they went high also before the invasion in 2021 because of China recovering after the pandemic, and you had high prices in the summer and fall of 2021 already, but the invasion came on top of that, which made it even higher prices. And of course, then Norway is profiting on this in a tremendous high gas prices for a while. But it's a sum of the global demand for gas and the disappearing of a lot of Russian gas that made this high prices. So it's not only the invasion, but then again, Norway has been, I think, one of the biggest contributors to support Ukraine in terms of different type of helps and also weapons. So some of this money is going to Ukraine afterwards. Yeah.
Can you see any pressure or any elements of this geopolitics in internal Norwegian politics? Like, because, it's more money, more responsibility, more countries, more diplomatic ties. Everything comes with that. So I would like to know, how the internal politics of Norway is dealing with that, especially your government.
No, I think, again, it has been very, we are a small country, doesn't mean anything to any of the big ones. And so we can actually play a small state politics still, but this has obviously changed a bit with the war, and especially after the explosions in the Baltic Sea, where you saw how vulnerable the infrastructure is. And Norway has I think it's 8,000 or 9,000 kilometers of natural gas pipelines, which is pretty difficult to defend, no? And we saw also that immediately when this happened, the other countries like Germany, France, Britain came with their navies to help surveillance and control. So obviously it was a clear sign that this is strategically important. And also the Equinor and Gassco, which is governing this natural gas infrastructure, came under the Security Act in Norway just a few days after the explosions, which was, a demonstrated fact that this is actually also security policy for Norway, which has been the case for a long time for Eastern European countries like Ukraine, Poland, and others. They see energy security as security policy, and they have been fighting for that within the EU for a long time without being heard in the West. But I think now the western part of the EU has also accepted that this is security policy. So also for Norway, and we have this double-sided being a western part of this Western European general political cooperation, and another situation that we are the single important natural gas exporter. But I think it's not entirely well developed how to deal with this dual situation and the specialities of our our location and situation as such a big petroleum exporter. So it is in the development, but the acceptance that this is strategically important is quite clear. And geopolitics now is not only the control of territory; it's also about how the control of territory or resources affect or is affected by international organizations and markets and behavior of other countries and companies. So it's a more mixture. So you can control something, and it doesn't mean anything if it's nullified by other international affairs, and vice versa. It can be reinforced if in other cases. So this will also affect Norway, I think, in my view. It's not official policy, in my view. I think it will affect us also diplomatic and economically in our relations with, especially the European Union in the time ahead. Yeah.
You mentioned pipelines, and there is a trendy name, pipeline geopolitics. So the question is, Norway and pipelines, how do you see the current infrastructure? And is there any discussion about, let's say, to build another one, or maybe to build different connections to Europe in terms of gas transport? Or Norway will keep it as it is, and LNG carriers will basically carry the gas to Europe. So how is this, and what sort of implications can you see in this area?
Well, as I said, the Norwegian pipeline infrastructure is all linked up to Northern Europe, and which we are actually stuck. We are depending on using these pipelines in the future, and for the time being, the receiving countries are also depending on it. But you mentioned LNG, which is a major change in the natural gas business, where you have the natural gas market has become global, not only European, and the prices are set globally, not only in Europe. Most of the Russian gas, which has left the market after the invasion, has been replaced by American gas as LNG. And more countries have been expanding or building new receiving terminals for LNG, so the market is changing a lot. The meaning that for Norwegian gas, you get a new type of competitors, not Russia primarily anymore, but it's a lot of different LNG exporters. First of all, the United States, but also others, Qatar and more. So it'll change over time. And in my view, which is, I don't know if it's considered in any type of government, but I think that to build more pipelines, to be stuck with more single receivers will be quite risky. That if we should expand the capacity of export, if we should do that, I think it should be done by LNG expansion to be more flexible too. And the EU also has suggested that long-term contracts shall not be allowed anymore after in 20 years or something, which is also making it more risky to depend on pipeline exports only. So today we are 95% of the export is pipeline. So this interdependency between Norway and the European Union may change over time to the disadvantage of Norway. It's possible.
And by the way, is there a public support for those plans to expand LNG business and to keep Norway with the international business in natural gas?
Well, I think it's no big discussion that the capacity should be expanded at all. I think we export 120 BCM per year now. And I think it's more a question of the replacement of reserves that are falling. The fields are depleted, so you have to replace some of it in order to maintain the capacity that we have. So I would say that it's not a big discussion or any discussion about building more pipelines, maybe to build or restructure them so it could be hydrogen in the future. Such things. And in terms of LNG expansion beyond the one that is in the northern Norway. I think surely companies have been considering it, but it's a big decision if you should do that because it's quite expensive. So most likely, I would say that the pipeline capacity is there, and it will be there, hopefully with no explosions to come. And the challenge is to maintain the level in the future.
If you take these high export levels after that war in Ukraine started, it's increasing and increasing. So the people are naturally interested in, how is Norway doing with the reserves? And that comes with the investment, because if there is a new field, you need to develop the new field. So how is Norway ready for this big export to European Union?
We have a discussion in Norway. We've talked about it a little bit already, that you have this climate split. Should we invest more to maintain production, or should we move to more green alternatives? The companies and the governments goes for more investments. And you can say that according to peak oil theories, you can say that the reserves are depleted, so it's empty. But you have different views on that. Because the more you drill, the more you work with it, the more you find. So actually, when you look at the statistics back 50 years, reserves are no bigger than because of this technological development and shape. So, and also in Norway, we've found more, and we use commercially more of one field now than before. So obviously the production will go down in the long term, depending how long that is, and we will face an industry that will probably not be bigger. It's a question how fast it will decline. But from a reserve point of view, I would assume, nobody knows for sure, but if you look at history, it would probably be possible to maintain a level like we have in the next decade or two at least.
To support these export and foreign policy objectives, do you have any energy doctrine or strategy of Norway? Because when the European Union was dependent on Russia, all those politicians, they always check the Russian energy strategy, Russian energy objectives, and all those documents. So I'm interested in, and also for my students, how is Norway in that area?
Norway is not a member of the European Union. We are having the EEA agreement, the European Economic Area, which means that we are part of the single market fully in all sectors except agriculture and fisheries. So energy is part of it. And Norway has adopted fully to the EU climate plans. So that part is part of EU policy. We implemented the EU law and regulations in the same way as member states. In terms of natural gas and oil, I think the EU sees Norway as a plus because it's considered a safe source, a friendly source, compared to most other oil-producing nations. There's more difficult relations than with Norway. So, again, we are. I think Norwegian governments is trying to behave within the single market rules and regulations in this term too. But obviously, in my view, that we have a special situation that we should also consider the interests of our export in terms of money. It affects our diplomacy and relations to other countries. It's not a political, it's a political issue too. And this is not developed very much in the Norwegian official policy. But of course, it's changing a bit. So I'm working with it too. To see how that is, that how can we actually develop to support our own specific interest within the Western community, which I think overwhelming support in Norway for being member of NATO. We are divided on the membership of EU, but still we are more or less part of the EU anyway. So it's not a big change. I think many countries think Norway is a member actually. So I think this is a work to be done, to be defining this special position of Norway because of our huge oil and gas interest. The profit we've taken from the last couple of years has not been part result from Norwegian policy. It's been events taking place that Norway benefited from. Either it's China or Russia or EU, whatever. So it is not part of our strategy. It's just a commercial policy. I have a long time agreed that we should call it a pure commercial issue. And we can maybe say that still in the official terms, but you have to consider also that in reality it is affecting us in many ways, and Norwegian, and the outside world is thinking about Norway as a big oil and gas exporter and a big capital owner and investor, maybe as the biggest characteristic of Norway in Norway. No?
And Norway is not only about oil and gas, but there are also other energy exports. So let's go through those ones with Professor Austvik. So first question, does Norway export electricity? And if so, where?
This has been a major political issue in Norway, which is actually dominating the debate much more than the questions of oil and gas export and activities, because we have been expanding the transmission capacities of electricity between Norway and Northern Europe. Denmark, Sweden, we had for a long time, even with Russia in the north, a small one. But now it is connected to German, British markets. So the price of electricity is now converging across Northern Europe as one market, with many exceptions. And that means that Norwegian electricity prices is going up because we had a more closed market, an oversupply of hydropower, meaning that we have been having low prices for decades. And it's a huge debate whether or not this is acceptable, that we have so high prices, because we are a small population, quite a big country, few people per square kilometer, and it's colder than in Prague and in other places. So we have a different situation than most other countries because of just climate, natural things. So this is a debate. We have now prices that are 2 to 5 times higher than we had a couple of years. So the government is heavily criticized for this, that they're not able to do something about it. It may be the biggest single issue that leads to such a tremendous decline in support for the current government. The high electricity prices imported from Europe.
You would be surprised, but when I spoke about this topic with my students, they told me, I asked, so what do you think? How expensive is electricity in Norway? And they said, well, they have everything. So they probably pay like 20 euros a month or something like that, because they compared you with those countries from the Middle East where the oil is super cheap. And I said, well, I would recommend you to visit Norway and, rent apartment for, let's say, 2 weeks. You will see that prices are not that low in Norway. So that's also, quite a big contrast that you have hydro, you have gas and everything, but still you pay high prices. And also we all know that prices generally are very high in Norway as a comparison to European Union. So that's interesting implication of all that. The second one is hydrogen. In European Union, everyone is speaking about hydrogen. as the next generation fuel. But what is the realistic expectation of hydrogen in Norway? And maybe you can elaborate a little bit about Norway as a potential supplier of hydrogen to the European Union in the next or upcoming years.
Actually, there's a lot of discussion in the government too, in the industry, how to make the blue hydrogen coming from natural gas then more competitive, cheaper. Currently, it's too expensive to be competing with other energies. So that is a major question. But if so, then it's also a question where it shall be produced at the entrance of the pipeline or the exit of the pipeline in the purchasing countries. In either case, the pipelines can be used for transportation. So I think it all depends on the technological change, whether you also can get green hydrogen from water, which is even more expensive now, but have a huge potential. So it's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of money invested, also government money invested in making this feasible. So it's left to see. Currently, I think it's like 95% of hydrogen is produced from natural gas and coal without capturing the CO2, while the blue hydrogen sort of from Norway is with the capture of the CO2. While the water produced from water, you don't have that problem, but you have a high cost. No? So it's all on, I think, in the energy business, a lot of changes are actually taking place of technological reasons. You have political events that takes place. You have the global warming. You have wars and things happening. But when you see the which affects the market, but when you see maybe the two most important changes over the last decade are technological. You have, for one, the shale revolution in the United States, where you suddenly have unlimited, more or less, resources to produce oil and gas deep down, and the become so cheap, so you can actually become independent, U.S. independent of importing oil and gas. Still, they import some oil, but they are being the biggest LNG exporter, and will grow and grow and grow without actually any limitations from the sources because of the technological change. It became cheap to produce. So LNG then adds to this big change to the natural gas market and make natural gas more attractive actually in the years ahead. I think the capacity of LNG export should be increased like 50% over the next 2 years only. The other big change is the cost reductions in solar energy, which has just a small fraction now of the cost as it was compared to 10 years ago, making solar energy the fastest growing renewable energy in the portfolio. And such changes might take place in the future too. So I think the hydrogen is waiting for a change. Maybe it comes, maybe it doesn't come. We don't know, but it could change a lot if they make it more cost effective. But when you see like the shale example and the solar example, they both existed a long time before the breakthroughs came. So without working with it, it will not come, the breakthrough. So meaning that you really don't know, you don't know this, but you can expect things to happen as long as you invest in it. And in Norway, I think it's for hydrogen, it's a thought that the government wants to support the work on it in the belief that suddenly someone will actually find a cost-effective way of producing it. But this change can come from anywhere. In China, maybe most likely, more likely, because they're so big and so intense in it.
What about the Arctic as the next domain? Russians, Chinese, and others, Canadians, they are interested in natural reserves of the Arctic. And it's a big discussion because of environmental protection. Then you have the access to those areas. It's not easy to drill oil or take gas from the Arctic. How is Norway approaching this domain?
That's a good important question, because as I said, the Norwegian oil and gas developers have been moving north, closer and closer to the Norwegian-Russian demarcation line. And the other country having jurisdiction over the Arctic, the Eurasian Arctic, is Russia. The other signatories of the Arctic Council is like on the other part of the North Pole, like Canada, US, and Denmark, actually, but Norway, Russia, and this part. And as you say, it's vulnerable, it's cold, so any accident will be much worse effect there than in the south. It's militarized. We have the Russian Northern Fleet in Murmansk area, but it's also been energized. So we have the biggest production area for Russian oil and gas is the Yamal area in northwestern Siberia. That's where the pipelines of Russian gas are moving gas to Russia and to Europe. But now they're expanding the LNG capacity in this peninsula, co-financed by China. So they sell more and more LNG to Europe, which is not sanctioned. So they have a lot of LNG export there, outside the pipelines. And they plan to expand it even more. So trade is becoming more important in this area too, and they will pass along the Norwegian coast in order to reach this market. So it will, and China is then also closer to Russia because of what is happening. And they are also involved in this area without having any exact border or geographic location there, but they're more and more involved. So you can see a picture that already has been a security policy issue because of the Northern Fleet and this. From the Cold War time, it has been an issue, but now also this economic development of the area will affect it more than just fisheries as it's been, and minerals and oil and gas will be maybe on the top of the list, which makes it a more hotspot for rivalry also between the big countries. So the NATO interests in this area has been linked very much to the military part of it, but now it probably must be expanded also to be relevant for energy trade and other economic engagement. And this it doesn't really affect Norway in a direct sense, but our location draws us into it. So it will be, as part of the Western world, we will be maybe affected by this renewed or enhanced attention in the area, and in Russia, the Arctic is a very high priority of their national interest in terms of economic and in terms of strategic aspects.
Some students ask, Norway is focusing on areas around Norway and the Arctic, but what about other domains, for instance, Africa or maybe some other oceans? Do you see any approach to those areas?
I think it's more attention actually to more remote places in the world, like developing countries and supporting developing countries. You can discuss how effective it is, but still we have a huge budget for supporting change in and development. Africa and other places, developing countries definition, and we also have, of course, the high ethical standard you mentioned already. That we, right or wrong, but we think we have the right standards, and we want to support these standards around the world. Right or wrong, I said, because maybe it's in China they were very irritating on that, so they had actually closed the diplomatic relations to Norway for a while because they got the Norwegian Nobel Committee gave a Nobel Peace Prize to a Chinese dissident opposing the Chinese regime. But when you talk about foreign policy in Norway, actually, that is my assessment, and I think we use a lot of more time on these remote, important areas than we do on our strategic interest, like oil and gas, or even also the strategic position. I think oil and gas and strategic position is more like the top national concerns, which are not that much discussed actually in the public debate.
You mentioned, and many people also ask about Norway as a part of Nordic countries or Scandinavia. Can we say a few words about energy security of Scandinavia, of Nordic countries? Perhaps what sort of energy cooperation is among those countries, and what's your opinion about the implications for the future?
But first of all, I think in Nordic countries, in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, we have languages that we can talk with each other and read each other's texts without translation. So it's very close. Like you could almost say it's dialects of the Scandinavian language. In Finland, you have a totally different language. And in Iceland, you have like we call Old Norwegian, so it's not easy to understand, but so we can't speak with the Icelandic directly. But we are all culturally have many similarities in Northern Europe. And we had a Nordic Council for I think from 1960 or something, which you have a cooperation between the countries. You could move, travel without a passport long time ago, long before the single market and the Schengen agreement. And close cooperation in many ways. In terms of energy, we have developed Scandinavian and then a Nordic electricity market. So before opening of the market towards Europe, we had a pricing convergence between Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and then partly Finland, expanding gradually. So that's an energy cooperation that you have increased security in one way because you have more sources to take from when something happens in one part of the Scandinavian or Nordic area. You can replace it with something else more easily. But in terms of oil and gas, of course, they buy Norwegian oil to the refineries, but they buy it from an open international market. So it's not a special deal between Norway and the other countries to do this. And natural gas is, they don't get it. You have the pipelines to Poland now, the Baltic pipeline, which is a side arm from the Norwegian pipeline to Germany, is passing Denmark before it comes to Poland. Then you have some Norwegian gas to Denmark as part of that, but it's not a very big part of the market still. So in oil and gas, I would say we don't have any particular cooperation. But of course, when Sweden and Finland becomes members of NATO, you get maybe more cooperation within the NATO in this area because we share borders and common interests in that sense. And but in terms of the European Union, as Norway is not part of the Union, but the others are. Iceland and Norway is not. We don't have that much of a cooperation, which might change if it could change within the context of the current regime and the EEA agreement, but it hasn't that much. Besides, we talk with each other, of course. But if Norway should become a member of the EU too, and the others also part of NATO, we have the same macro umbrella, you could say, in security policy and then economic and political affairs, then you could imagine that you get more cooperation between the Nordic countries in terms of common interest and common values and common things that might affect many areas. But in terms of energy, I would say that will be maybe more like a renewable part. Sweden is more ahead of us than in renewables because they had to. We didn't have to. More types of that, and electricity still, of course, but for oil and gas, and not necessarily. It doesn't have the potential to be anything special Nordic about it. But LNG, for instance, is the Norwegian LNG, the small part of it, which is LNG, is now going, for instance, to the Baltic countries to support them. So they have replaced Russian gas with some of it Norwegian gas and Norwegian regasification ships, because that's also shipping is also a big industry in Norway. So all this trade on boats affects Norway in many ways because of the big, huge shipping industry.
One question comes from students, and they are interested in what is the nuclear energy role or profile in Norway?
That's interesting. It has been discussed now. I think we're all over the world. The nuclear has come back more considered as a more realistic alternative, and would actually also change the picture because it's a known technology. And I heard one said that China would actually now considering the ability to produce smaller nuclear power plants for export. So if they can do that, we can have local electricity in each municipality almost. It will change the energy world a lot. So I am not an engineer, so I don't know the risk, but politically, after the Fukushima accident in Japan, like 10 years ago or something, I think, as I understand it, is not considered risky anymore. And Finland and France is having a lot of nuclear, so they trust it both. So if this is the case, I think nuclear is can come back all over the world, in Europe especially, but it has been discussed also in Norway. Different types of nuclear actually also, but I think it all depends on the technology. If you need to make a nuclear power plant in a huge mega size, I don't think that's realistic in Norway in foreseeable future. But if the technology becomes like at a smaller scale, it will probably be discussed in a more realistic manner anywhere, probably. So in that sense, I think we're part of the rest of the West. But of course, when we have all this energy in terms of oil and gas and water, hydropower, maybe in Norway we become a little more relaxed about the situation than especially in Eastern Europe, where you have this energy security as a political risk, so up in front, that we are more relaxed. Yeah, but we have the discussion. Yes.
The last question for today's interview. You were researching energy security, geopolitics, political economy, and all those disciplines related to energy and internal market, but also foreign policy. What would be your priorities for the next development of the Norwegian energy sector? That's the first question. And the second question, is there anything that Norway can do in foreign policy to secure the energy export and relations with countries that are buying energy from Norway?
Well, I think, but I thought for a long time, there is a resistance in Norway to politicize the energy sector. It is mostly about this climate split. Should we put so much money into it or not? And so far, even after the discussions after what's happened in Ukraine and in Baltic Sea, you don't have a more what I would call a realistic policy approach in the debate. But of course, people are thinking about it in defense, in foreign ministry, and so on. But the debate is not like that. It is not touching this. So we are still having to emphasize on what we talked about in the developing countries and all these ethical standards that we think is the best in the world, which is maybe it's a bit too self-oriented, actually. It's a small debate like that. We have a debate coming on the European Union membership. Some things, of course, we have split. Some think we should go in. We should leave the EEA agreement. That is as part of the debate. So, in terms of what Norway could support, I think in official policy, it's obviously a clear wish to support European energy situation and stability in a cooperation in all senses with the EU countries. We can discuss how much we should have should do that, just both in terms of renewable investments rather, and also how much money we should put into one single basket. Because this industry is so profitable that it takes the attention away from other sectors very much. So I don't. I'm really surprised for a long time, because I've been working with these issues in geopolitical sense and so on, that they should actually consider this to be more important in the debate, but it is really not. There are not many people analyzing it and working with it either, even though the word geopolitics has become very much more popular now everywhere. It is not implemented very much in the debate. So I don't know if we will have a real big change on Norwegian attention towards the ethical ideals and towards a more realistic policy aspects. And let's hope nothing will happen in the North Sea or any place with a Norwegian installation. That would change the attitude maybe. And the support for NATO, I think, is overwhelmingly big after these events. Like I think like 90% or more. So that is one issue that we are supporting that part of the Western cooperation entirely. That's the public opinion and the government policy, I think. But in economic and political parts of it, we treat it still as a domestic issue and not a foreign policy issue. Which again, it might be a good policy for a small state to have a low, not a bragging way of doing it. It's good, I think, in many ways, but still we have to be concerned that we are actually involved in the big high politics because of the size of our reserves and exports.
Professor Gunnar Austvik, thank you very much for your time, insights and comments, and it was fascinating to speak with you about geopolitics and energy of Norway. I think this topic is going to merge as more and more topic for research and international relations as Norway is increasing energy export. And I encourage junior researchers and researchers to have a look at Norway. Fascinating country. I visited it many times. And I just like speaking about Norway because it's also a country of paradoxes, you know. As professors mentioned, high energy prices and high energy resources. That's one aspect. But there are more. So thank you very much, Professor Gunnar Austvik. It was a pleasure to have you, and I wish you good luck with all the research, energy for your next steps in teaching and researching Norwegian and international energy relations. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
See you next time.